I sometimes roll my eyes at reporters from major media and their visits to diners to talk with real Americans in flyover land. But I found myself one morning at the Corner Cafe on the main street of Elizabethtown, population 3,000 plus, in North Carolina's border belt. A half-dozen white men in their late 60s and older sat around a table in the middle of the cafe. I'd learned the day before, talking with one of the men, that these guys meet here every weekday.
Name's Ray.
Ray? Nice to meet you, Ray. Rudy? Some used to run local businesses, or still do. There's a banker and a dentist, both retired. Several of the men say an important reason they come to this table most days is to find out what's going on in their community. Cue the self-deprecating quip.
The problem is when we get home and the wives say, "What did y'all learn today?" We can't remember anything.
But their need for information is no joke. I tell them I'm trying to understand how Americans actually experience the news media. The talk soon comes around to the news coverage of Bladen County and how barren it is compared to a few decades ago.
We don't have a source. The Bladen Journal.
This is Ray Cross, the retired dentist. He explains that his wife, Denise Cross, worked at the local newspaper, the Bladen Journal, all through the 1980s and into the 90s, eventually serving as editor. Back then, the paper had a staff of several full-time reporters.
You know, they'd have somebody, if there was a commissioner's meeting, somebody was there and gave you a report. If there was a board of education, somebody was there and gave a report. You get nothing to that.
You didn't think we were important.
They tell you there's going to be a meeting, not what happened, what's going on, anything. So there was a Bladen County Planning Board meeting last night about a big issue, and you won't hear what it was about. We are really in a starved area as far as local news goes.
For a few years in the 2000s, the Bladen Journal came out 5 days a week.
Now that was a hustle, because there were actually two papers here, Southeastern Times and the Bladen Journal at one point.
In the same town?
Same town. And, very competitive. Of course, you got to sell advertisements to make it a go of it and that type of thing. But just the small markets started to suffer.
You actually looked at the Bladen Journal?
That's Robin Summerlin, who owns a local business, asking if I've ever read the Bladen Journal. It serves this county of 30,000 people and now comes out weekly.
In my opinion, it's nothing but fluff. The headline the other day was 550 people running in the race at Lou Mill. That was the number one top story. No news.
But once again,
hear that? No news.
It's just him and his wife at the paper, isn't that right?
Yeah, they have an office person.
Yeah, they don't have.
I don't count her at
staff.
all. I don't count her.
We're one of the biggest counties, and we go from East Arcadia all the way over to White Oak. And
when I met Mark DeLap in 2025, he was the editor and general manager of the Bladen Journal. He has since retired. He's not from Bladen County, and the paper's owners aren't either. DeLap ran the paper for Champion Media, based 170 miles away near Charlotte. Champion owns a collection of small-town papers in 7 states, including a handful of others around the border belt.
Right now, we're heading toward the downtown area. The courthouse is over to the left.
The Bladen Journal's history in Elizabethtown dates to 1898. It was independently owned until the 2000s, when a newspaper chain acquired it. It was sold several more times before Champion bought it in 2017. Mark DeLap is originally from Wisconsin. Before coming to the Journal in 2024, he edited rural newspapers in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wyoming.
I've been used to working in areas where I'm the staff. Here, when I came here, it was the same thing, and that appeals to me because I have the creative control of what goes into the newspaper.
When I'm there in 2025, DeLap does have a customer service rep, a part-time sports editor who mainly covers the high school teams, and a few unpaid contributors, including his wife who writes a food column. Mark inherited a Bladen Journal that had already been downsized. He talks with pride about changes he's made, like ramping up the use of photography.
I wanted big pictures. I wanted a lot of color. We went from having 4 or 5, maybe up to 8 pictures in a newspaper to almost 40 pictures a week. I'm a photographer, so that's kind of one of my passions.
Mark's own articles are usually profiles of local people and other features, or light personal essays, for example, about his failed attempts to raise houseplants. He admits there's not a lot of news in his paper.
It is a small community. It's not like we've got a lot of news. We have to prioritize what we are putting in. I write so much content sometimes during the week that things sometimes don't get in.
DeLap knows that some in the community are not satisfied with the Journal in its current state, but he says that's the life of a journalist. You won't please everyone.
Some people have said this is the best it's ever been. And some say, no, you don't cover everything you're supposed to cover and things like this. And so when you got one person trying to run to all the stories and cover it all, that's, I think, the best you can do.
How you doing, Chenj?
Hey, John. I'm doing all right, one day at a time, man.
Yeah.
My dad used to say, I'm fighting hard and ducking fast. But what you found in Bladen County, North Carolina, that's happening in thousands of communities across the country. And some people know about this, like especially if you work in media or study media like I do. But I think a lot of people haven't really grasped what's happened to journalism or really how this happened in places like Bladen County.
We're really talking about the collapse of local news in this country. And it's happened quickly in just a couple of decades. And to me, I got to say, I think this is an example of the news media not doing a very good job of covering the news media.
Right. I mean, it's like the story's out there, but I don't feel like it's really gotten the light it deserves.
Yeah, I think the scale of it hasn't sunk in for a lot of people. And here's a shocking statistic. The per capita number of working reporters at the local level across the United States declined by 75% in less than 25 years. That was the finding of a study that came out in 2025 from a nonprofit group called Rebuild Local News and the journalism website Muckrack.
Yo, 75% is crazy. I mean, that's just like, picture 4 local journalists, like in your area. 3 of them just got raptured, right? They went away, got a job doing something else, and then they weren't replaced.
It's actually stunning to contemplate. Here's another way of stating what's happened across the country. Imagine you live in a city of 100,000 people. In 2002, your city would have had 40 working journalists. As of 2025, it had 8.
And here's the thing. We both work in journalism and, we teach it. So it might sound self-serving for us to talk about how important news reporters are. But on this one, I actually feel like most Americans would agree with us.
At least we used to. Now, these days, people might have so little regard for the news media that a lot of people might feel differently, might just kind of shrug it off. But at the same time, we have access to so much news and information on our devices. And I think that's probably another reason why this hasn't really landed. It's just so easy to miss what's been lost.
It's a good point. I mean, I wouldn't blame people for thinking, what are you talking about, news deserts? What news desert? There's a fire hose of news and chatter coming at us, right? You open your phone and it just sort of gushes out. So that's how it feels. But in reality, for a lot of people all over the country, that stream of information doesn't include the substantive local reporting about important things going on right around us that folks took for granted just a generation ago.
So when we talk about a small community, a place like Elizabethtown, North Carolina, having, say, 4 people reporting the news and that number drops to 1 or none, we're not talking about like pet groomers. I mean, no shade to pet groomers.
Definitely no shade to pet groomers. No, but like journalism is different. Like, let me give you an example. Like in my neighborhood, we got a lot of different kinds of treats. It's like you got bagels and cookies and donuts, which is my favorite. And then you have mini donuts. Now, if suddenly like mini donuts went away, I mean, I'm not saying it wouldn't be a problem. You know, the mini donut community would be very, very upset. But it wouldn't be like, this is a crisis for democracy, like for our whole democracy. It would be like, this is a mini donut crisis.
News is different, right? When you have a market failure in journalism, and it seems like news organizations are only firing reporters, not hiring them, that's a problem for everybody. And we're going to talk more later in this episode about precisely why it's a problem.
Listen, the title of this episode is When the News Dies. And what we're talking about is what actually died and who killed it.
From the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, this is Scene on Radio, Season 8, The News, Episode 2. I'm John Biewen.
And I'm Chenjerai Kumanyika. In this season, we're trying to make sense of just how badly the news is failing us in the United States today, how things got this way, and what it all means.
And eventually, what to do about it. In this episode, the near death of local news and how it happened.
And what does that trend have to do with all these other crises we're living through, including the extreme divisions in our society and the failure of our government to really serve the needs of the people?
We're going to go back to the border belt to see if we can shed light on these things. And then, Chenj, you and I will meet up again and unpack it all. If you want to know why, of all the places we could have gone for this project, we decided to hang out in the border belt of southeastern North Carolina. Well, one clincher was finding out that Penelope Muse Abernathy lives here.
I'm Penny.
I'm Penny, John. We're in Scotland County now, near the county seat of Laurinburg.
Almost at peak for the azaleas and the rhododendron. But,
Penny lives with her husband in her childhood home, which she tells me her parents built themselves after World War II.
That's what people don't realize is when you live in the country, it's always something. I mean, it is...
Abernathy decided to come home in retirement, but she had a long career holding important jobs elsewhere.
I am a retired professor, retired business executive for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Harvard Business Review, and a journalist. And once a journalist, always a journalist.
Abernathy ended her career in academia at the University of North Carolina and then at Northwestern. She's one of the nation's leading experts on the collapse of the journalism industry, and in particular on news deserts. More on what that means in a minute. Penny's story offers a revealing window into the media crack-up, especially in newspapers, and how it flowed from bigger technological and economic changes.
The summer after I graduated from high school, I started as a journalist at the Laurinburg Exchange right here.
The Laurinburg Exchange, which serves Scotland County, is another weekly that dates to the 19th century. Today it's owned by the same chain that owns the Bladen Journal and has a similar skeleton staff. Penny went to the University of North Carolina in the early 70s, working summers at the Laurinburg and Greensboro newspapers. After graduating, she reported for papers in North Carolina, Kansas, and finally at a Dallas daily that no longer exists.
While at the Dallas Times-Herald, I had one of those great epiphanies where you realize that the great journalism war that was going on then was not going to necessarily be won by good journalism.
At the time, in the early 1980s, Dallas was one of the last cities that still had two daily papers fighting for dominance and survival, the Times-Herald and the Morning News. Both had good reporters who covered the city well, she says. But Penny saw that her paper was going to lose out because of unwise business decisions
that were often being made by chains with leaders who lived out of the community and basically focused on the profit.
Penny reached out to a trusted mentor, an executive with the Knight Ridder newspaper chain.
And I called him up and I said, I've just realized the war is going to be lost here. And he said, if you care about good journalism, you need to learn the business.
Abernathy got a mid-career fellowship at Columbia to study business and economics journalism. She stayed to get her MBA and learn finance.
And, what it did is it taught me to understand what was going on with private equity at that point. It taught me how to understand hedge funds.
In other words, she got educated about the piles of capital that drive what happens in the U.S. economy, including the news industry, and how the people who move that money around really operate. Next, Penny spent 14 years at the New York Times Company as an analyst in its regional newspaper group, then as business manager of the Times newsroom. Finally, she rose to a senior vice president position where she oversaw important changes in the paper's business model.
That was also a glorious time because it was the rollout of the national edition nationwide. It was and the establishment of the full-color New York Times, and it was also the establishment of nytimes.com.
She moved on to other top media jobs: publisher of the Harvard Business Review, senior vice president at the Wall Street Journal, and a VP job at the Paley Center for Media, which involved convening internationally the CEOs of media companies.
I'm going to take you a quick loop around, show you where I went to school, but all you're going to be able to see now is my where I went in first grade.
Penny came home to North Carolina in 2008 to a chaired professorship at the UNC Chapel Hill Journalism School. In that job for 12 years, she commuted to Chapel Hill from her home here in the Border Belt.
So, Scotland County has had, it's the classic rural agricultural county that has a lot of corporate farming, right?
Take a drive with Penny and you'll get an economic history lesson. We're passing through Laurel Hill, a tiny former cotton mill town.
Now, you talk about something that is kind of distressing, is that once you lost the corporate farmers, or they transitioned to something else, right? And you lost the cotton mills, you lost those communities too. So there's nothing really left there except a post office, but it is a good post office, and I sure hope it doesn't get closed or privatized.
The deep economic changes of the last few decades are key to the story of American journalism and its collapse. But before we tell that story, here's Penny talking about happier times, just 1 or 2 generations ago.
I think the kind of golden age of newspaper journalism was from the late 70s up through the early aughts.
In those years, newspapers were thriving financially and expanding their staffs. Lots of metro papers prided themselves on serving not just their cities, but their states, or big chunks of their states.
For instance, you get the Raleigh paper in North Carolina saying they covered eastern North Carolina like kudzu. And in fact, they did. Similarly for Charlotte. So we benefited in North Carolina by having really 4 or 5 really robust metro papers. You had one in Charlotte, you had one in Raleigh, you had the Greensboro and the Winston-Salem paper, and then you had the Fayetteville and the Wilmington papers and the Asheville papers kind of coming in at the right under that big umbrella.
Between the 1950s and 2000, North Carolina newspapers, large and small, won 10 Pulitzer Prizes, including 7 just in the 1980s and 90s. They won for investigations into brown lung disease among textile workers, a contaminated small-town water supply and the local government's failure to fix it, and health and environmental risks from the state's hog farming industry, along with other prizes for cartooning and commentary. In those days, North Carolina's bigger city papers had one-person bureaus dotted across the regions they covered. So the Raleigh, Wilmington, and Fayetteville papers all had reporters working and competing for stories in the Border Belt, in addition to the local papers, at least one in each county, with several full-time journalists. In the early 2000s, North Carolina's 2 biggest papers, the Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh News and Observer, each boasted a newsroom of 250 to 300 people. But that was then. As of 2026, each of those papers employs just a few dozen journalists, a small fraction of their reporting power a few decades ago. Combined with the collapse of most small-town papers, this means there's almost nobody covering a lot of these rural counties. period. Through her work at the University of North Carolina, Penny Abernathy popularized the term news desert.
I define a news desert as an area, whether urban, suburban, or rural, where there is very limited access, and I want to say very limited access, to the type of critical news and information that feeds a democracy at the local level and brings us together to solve problems.
She considers a county to be a news desert if it has only one newspaper or none. The latest edition of a national report that Abernathy created at UNC found that about 2/3 of North Carolina's 100 counties are now news deserts, including 3 of the 4 border belt counties we're focusing on for this series: Scotland, Robeson, and Bladen. Penny and her husband Harry, a retired pastor, and like her, a former newspaper reporter, are active news consumers. But she tells me even they just come up empty sometimes.
Let me give you 2 examples. The first one is with local county commissioner races here. I tried like the Dickens to find out where people stood. I basically ended up not voting in that because I'm not going to vote if I can't get the information. The same thing happened with sheriff's race 2 years before. And I mean, my husband and I, as former journalists, we are diligent. We know how to go get the information.
But you can't find a news article that no one has written or published. So what happened between that financial golden age for newspapers from the 70s to the 2000s and today?
Well, you know, we look at 2 or 3 inflection points right here. And so it's really quite common to say digital did it and Craigslist killed off the newspapers. In fact, Craigslist really hurt the large metros.
In those lucrative years, newspapers made most of their money from advertising, including classifieds. Craigslist, founded in 1995, gave businesses and anyone with a couch or a car to sell a cheaper and sometimes free way to advertise. Other online advertisers joined in, from Facebook to Cars.com. For big city newspapers, demand for ads fell off a cliff. That didn't really happen in small towns. Abernathy says local businesses like car dealers and retail stores still routinely advertised in their hometown papers into the 2000s. But the spread of big box stores like Walmart took out a lot of retailers, and the Great Recession of 2008 killed off countless other local businesses.
When Wall Street sneezed and then had a cold and then pneumonia, it was disastrous for many of these small rural communities that were still supporting a local newspaper because Main Street suffered horrendously, especially in the aftermath of the mortgage crisis and everything else.
Across the country, newspapers were now hemorrhaging cash and market value. Several thousand went under. The U.S. has lost 1/3 of its newspapers since 2005, according to Abernathy and her colleagues at Northwestern. The collapse of their business model brought about a dramatic shift in the incentives for newspaper owners. Penny explains, before the Great Recession, if you wanted to buy a strong local newspaper, you had to pay about 14 times that paper's annual profit.
Think about that for a moment. That means if you're going to own a newspaper for 14 years, you're going to have to invest if you want to sell it again.
In other words, you had to keep the paper strong for more than a decade just to get your investment back and to entice the next buyer.
In the aftermath of 2008, suddenly you could own a newspaper for 3 times earnings.
Now, as an investor, you could get your money back much more quickly. This was like a flashing blue light special for private equity firms to buy up newspapers by the dozen.
And at the end of 3 years, you can decide, you can come in, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to slash costs. And I'll go on and milk the cow, harvest it, or I will flip it, which there were a lot of flipping. Or the third thing, you can just say, oh gosh, we cut costs. There's just no we're going to consolidate it with another paper 4 counties away. And that's how you end up with getting what I call ghost newspapers. Papers that are still published, either online or in print, but they have really nobody on staff.
The newspapers we're talking about in the border belt, like the Bladen Journal we visited in this episode, are not quite ghost papers by Penny's definition. They have at least one full-time journalist on staff. But they are a shell of what they used to be. The bare-bones staffing of papers like these affects not only the stories that are covered and not covered, but also the quality of what they print.
The confidence and the trust has really, really diminished.
This is Althea Weaver. She lives in the tiny, mostly black town of East Arcadia, 25 miles from Elizabethtown. She was chair of the Democratic Party in Bladen County from 2023 until the spring of 2025.
Sometimes there's editorials that are in the Bladen Journal that I would call questionable.
A disturbing example, she says, came in 2024. The day before the general election, November 4th, the Bladen Journal printed a statement from Weaver's Republican counterpart that contained inflammatory misinformation.
The Republican Party chair, he put an article that was very, very controversial. Talked about immigrants in Bladen County being allowed to vote, and they were not registered, and just stirred up a whole bunch of controversy that was not true.
The claim was that undocumented immigrants were voting, which of course would be illegal. It would have been one thing if the paper had quoted the man making these accusations in a news article while accurately identifying him as a partisan official and pointing out there was no evidence for his claims, which there wasn't according to the North Carolina Election Board. But that's not what the Bladen Journal did. It billed its article as pre-election voting information from neutral government officials. The lead referred to last-minute updates from the state and county election boards. The article then reprinted a short press release from the state election board in Raleigh, routine stuff about who was eligible to vote, followed by this in the same article. The following was sent via email from Wayne Schaefer of the Board of Elections. FYI, important to note that Hispanic voters are suddenly showing up at the polls at the last minute despite 17 days of available early voting. We are seeing reports of Guatemalan and Venezuelan individuals showing up to vote, but not all of them have proof of citizenship or of legitimate photo ID. If you see this sort of thing going on, in case you didn't catch it, the article had a serious factual error, aside from the unsubstantiated allegations about voter fraud. It wrongly identified the author of the statement, Wayne Schaefer, as being a member of the Bladen County Election Board, when in fact he was the county Republican Party chairman, not a nonpartisan government official, but very much a partisan player. The paper's manager and editor, Mark DeLap, told me it was an honest mistake and not his fault.
That was kind of a strange situation because
DeLap said he mistakenly described Schaefer as being with the County Board of Elections because a member of that board emailed him Schaefer's statement, along with other information from the board.
We pretty much just print what the Board of Elections sends us.
DeLap said a board member named Michael Aycock sent him the Schaefer statement.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Aycock. When I reached him on the phone, Mike Aycock, a Republican member of the 5-member election board, confirmed that he'd received the statement about illegal voting written by the GOP chairman and passed it on to Mark DeLap at the newspaper. He told me he's sure that DeLap knew who Wayne Schaefer was, so he can't explain why DeLap's article misidentified Schaefer as part of the election board.
I am regretful that Mr. DeLap apparently had a lapse or whatever and got it wrong. sorry that happened. It happened. You can't go back and fix it. I am confident that it wasn't oopsie, if you will. He did not mean anything malicious by it or whatever. It just, I was in the military for 23 years and shit happens, so.
Mark DeLap concedes that his paper printed false information. But despite a request from the State Board of Elections that he issue a correction, he told me he'd felt no need to do so.
I would not have run a correction because it came out of their office.
That is from the county election board.
If I write something and I make a mistake, I'll write a correction. But if I didn't write it, how am I going to correct it? That's not journalism.
Your newspaper printed it, though, and it was... Actually, it is journalism. DeLap printed a factual error, not to mention explosive, baseless allegations. Good reporting would have meant correcting those errors.
Damn.
Let me just say here, Chenj, that I first learned about this incident with the Bladen Journal from a nonprofit online publication, the Border Belt Independent. We're going to hear more about that publication later in our series.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear about that. And there's just so much in this story to highlight that I think talks about what it means to really try to understand what's happened to news. I mean, let's go all the way back to those guys in the diner that you talked to, the first conversation, right? I mean, they're talking real clearly about the disintegration of their local newspaper over a couple of decades. And, they're thinking about why it happened. And for them, it's like the difficulty of finding advertisers, right? And of course, that is part of it. But then Penny Abernathy, and by the way, oh my God, what a what a career. She takes everything to a whole nother level of understanding, right? So she talks about why the newspaper business hit a brick wall, right? Not just actually Craigslist, right? But also this has to do with what was happening in the economy around Walmart and the stores that would have been buying ads, right?
Yeah, and the Great Recession.
Right, and the recession. And ultimately, this basically turns the newspaper business into something really different, actually, right? Like, we're looking at it like it's the newspaper business, right? But to a large extent, it's, in that context, once you understand what's going on there, the prices are going down, and why people are suddenly buying these papers up, they're not looking at it as a for-profit civic institution. It's just an investment opportunity for a few private equity firms and, vulture or venture capitalists, whatever you prefer. I prefer vulture. But anyway, and then we come to this last story about the Bladen Journal and that reporting blunder, and it's like, it really drives it home, right? It's like, I just think about Penny and her husband. They're trying to find real news, about the elections. And then you have this reporting error, and yeah, it's just a really interesting through line and a concrete example of how those changes affect everyday people and the kind of news and information that we have access to.
Yeah, in this case, an article in the newspaper the day before an election.
Right.
We're trying to tie this to the importance of journalism in a democracy, and it's almost too spot on.
It's like, as I'm understanding this, Mark DeLap, the editor of the Bladen Journal, he's basically a one-man news operation, right?
Yes, along with a few volunteers and a part-time sports reporter.
Right, and the dude is probably overwhelmed. He says he's pressed for time, and maybe that's why he didn't have time to check out these explosive claims that were sent to him about people voting illegally. And maybe that's the reason that he slipped up in identifying the guy making the claims.
And it's also important to say that Mark DeLap was new to Elizabethtown when this happened. He'd been there less than a year.
I just want to point out that this isn't really a story about his bad intentions, right? As necessarily as some kind of partisan actor, right? It doesn't have to be about that. Because even if we give him the benefit of the doubt that it was an honest mistake and he just forgot that the guy, Wayne Schaefer, was the chair of the Republican Party in his county and not part of the elections board,
it still shows that there's been like this structural weakness put in, because now you have a news organization who has to cover the news in that area, but he doesn't even know the community that well.
And look, he has a tough job. I worked in very small public radio newsrooms in small cities early in my so-called career with, where we had just a couple of reporters. But these were places, bigger places that had solid newspapers and other media at that time. And I felt like I could just find some decent stories that my listeners would find interesting, knowing the essential stuff was being covered by somebody and that my listeners had access to it. Somebody was covering the city council and the school board and, city government and so on and so forth. I can't even imagine being basically the only working reporter in a county with tens of thousands of people and trying to report on everything that matters. It's just really not doable.
And by one estimate, that's the situation in almost 1/3 of counties in the U.S. right now. 1,000 counties don't even have the equivalent of one full-time journalist, which is, whew.
Yeah, so it's not about beating up on Mark DeLap. It's about the systemic disintegration of local news in this country, which has happened before our eyes, again, in only 20 or 25 years. In fact, let's take a second and describe this visual image. Chenj, you and I both have it in front of us. It's from that study by the group Rebuild Local News in partnership with Muckrack. And so for the listeners, picture a map of the U.S. with thin lines marking off the nation's 3,100 counties, okay? Each county on this map is color-coded according to how rich or poor it is in journalists, okay? So it's deep blue if it's got lots of reporters per capita, light orange if it has just a few for every 100,000 people, and dark orange for a county that has less than one journalist per 100,000 people.
When you understand what this map means, it's chilling. In the year 2000, the average county would have been blue. Now, the map is mostly orange, pale orange, and a whole lot of dark orange, with patches of blue here and there, like lakes dotted across the landscape of Mars or something like that. It almost doesn't make sense to talk about news deserts as if they're isolated pockets. This map I'm looking at, most of the country is a news desert. And this isn't some academic observation or just something we should be sad about. This is incredibly dangerous. When you don't have any news reporters to hold people and institutions accountable, that just puts even more power in the hands of people who already had disproportionate power.
So now what's the bigger picture behind this mostly orange map? What's the underlying economic reality that made this collapse possible?
Well, the people with power in the United States decided over a couple of centuries, and definitely over the last 40 or 50 years, that for the most part, we're going to have a for-profit market-based news media.
Yes, a much more thoroughly market-based and with a lot less public funding for journalism than most other rich countries like ours.
So, I mean, to me, like, this is what you get when you set up things that way, right? A media system that depends on advertising to pay the bills, and then the business model crashes and burns. And we'll have more to say about journalism as a for-profit commodity as we move through the season. But I actually think we should slow down and really think about this for a minute. Because, it's obvious that when you have a big news desert like this, when you have most of the country looking like a news desert, people aren't going to get the information they need. But there's also a whole set of other consequences that aren't as obvious.
Yeah, in fact, let's bring in one more voice, one more interview I did. Angelica is with Democracy Fund. It's a grant maker that works to shore up news organizations with funding and other kinds of support.
There are so many different angles to this crisis. It's not just one thing.
Here's Angelica.
But I think that from any angle, I think we can all agree that the status quo is fundamentally broken.
To your point, Chenjerai, about these deeper kind of ramifications for communities and for democracy, Angelica talked about a report that Democracy Fund put out a few years ago called How We Know Journalism is Good for Democracy. It pulled together a bunch of studies on what you might call the civic health of communities that have or don't have a strong news presence.
Some of what they have found is that when there is a lack of specifically local news, that voter turnout declines. People are less likely to vote in local elections. People are less likely to generally be civically engaged. Fewer people run for office. And people are more likely to vote along party lines on the ballot. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, it's just fascinating that that's true and maybe not totally obvious, right? Because why would people become more disengaged and less likely to vote or run for office? Because they live in a news desert, right? There is some well-known research that could shed some light on this. It was done by a couple of scholars at the University of North Carolina, as it turns out, in the 70s. And it looked at the agenda-setting role of the media.
Yeah, the agenda-setting role, right? What these researchers found, they surveyed voters around election time about what the most important issues were in a political campaign. And they found that folks' answers lined up very closely with the issues that the media focused on in that campaign. Surprise, surprise.
So it's like the significance of the research could be, broken down like this. The news media really can't tell people what to think, but it does have real power in telling its readers and viewers what to think about.
What to pay attention to.
A strong local newspaper or radio or TV station or whatever can really focus people's attention on what the issues are, the problems that local leaders and activists are trying to solve. And if you don't have that kind of gathering place for news and information, and you just have the word of mouth or, social media chatter about a couple of topics, people can almost forget that there are shared issues to deal with in their community.
Or that they, as a citizen, might have a role to play in working on or even caring about these issues. Listen to something Althea Weaver said to me. She's the woman from Bladen County we heard from a few minutes ago. She has done 2 stints as a Democratic Party chair in the county, one here in the 2020s and another term 20 years earlier.
I can say that this by far has been a lot different than it was from 2000 to 2004.
Say more about that. How so?
Membership has dropped off drastically. Cannot seem to get young people involved. Young people nowadays just don't seem to, I don't want to say they don't care, but they're just not really concerned enough to get involved. Our daughters, we got 2 daughters. One is 33 and the other one is 26. And they are concerned about doing nothing except voting. Once they vote, then that's it.
Wow. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for a shift like that, but it's consistent with those studies showing that people get less politically engaged when their sources of local news dry up. But it's also about what happens when people are a little bit engaged, right? So I want to pick up on something else Angelica said. The studies have found people are more likely to vote along straight party lines when they don't have good local news.
This is really interesting. And again, it's not obvious why it would be the case.
But if you think about it, the lack of local news leaves this void, right? Where people used to give some of their attention to reading or hearing about issues and leaders close to home, like the stuff happening in your neighborhood, right? So now it's like that information isn't there. So what winds up filling the void and taking all of people's attention is national news, right? Or stuff that's not really even new. It's like what folks call news-like information.
Which can mean everything from podcasts to social media to late-night comedy shows. Here's Angelica again.
When there's no local news and information, then the national news cycle is even louder. And what we know about national news is that it amplifies polarization. It drives people to their camp and their tribe. It amplifies the us versus them narrative.
And why? Because national news coverage is so steeped in this partisan horse race, and everything's framed as left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. I mean, that's definitely the case with mainstream media, And of course, it's even more amped up on social media.
The clickbait is wild. If you've watched some videos, say on YouTube, that have to do with politics, the algorithm will quickly decide what your politics are and then offer you an endless stream of clips with screaming headlines, right? So-and-so on your side of the political divide destroys or demolishes or dismantles somebody on the other side.
So we all know that's the media world we live in now, right? But the fact that local news has just shriveled the way it is really makes the problem worse, because people are spending more time in these national wars over politics and culture.
So we've been talking a lot about politics and voting and all that, but there's so much more that a functioning news organization does in a city or town or a rural place. And then as a result, so much more that's missing in a news desert.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, look, just to keep score, in a news desert, there's little or no coverage of what's happening in the schools or what the school board is up to, right? No one keeping tabs on local companies and employers, whether they're polluting, how they're treating their workers. No coverage of police, except typically taking reports from the police and just sticking them into the newspaper or a news website with no checking or vetting. You're getting no investigative reporting about any of these institutions to hold them accountable. And definitely little, if any, coverage of marginalized communities, of course, unless they show up in those police reports.
There's real evidence that the catastrophic decline of local news is hurting communities and our society, our democracy as a whole.
It is a problem that people are aware of, right? At least some folks. And there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, people and organizations doing some good work, trying innovative ways to fill the void. But man, you look at that map, it's a big hill to climb.
And, you know, when you refer to people doing interesting things, that's true in the border belt, too. We're going to hear more later about some efforts to plug the hole in the border belt and about what it would really take to fix the country's broken media system later in the season. But next time.
Now, I recognize, sadly, that the Washington press corps is all too often the Praetorian Guard of the left.
No wonder people hate the media. Now, at this point, neither the press nor the Democrats have a shred of cred.
Some people might have listened to all this talk about disappearing journalists and thought, good riddance. The fewer reporters, the better. Because everybody knows the news media on the whole has a liberal bias. But does it? We'll take a fresh look. The News was created and produced by me, John Biewen, with Chenjerai Kumanyika and story editor Diane Hodson. Assistant producer Arlene Arevalo. Fact-checking by Anna Pujol Mazzini. Production help this time from Robert Frazier. Music by Brian Blade and the Fellowship Band, Michelle Osis, Lily Hayden, Alex Weston, Goodnight Lucas, and Jason Hill. Music consulting by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. You can find transcripts at our website, scenonradio.org. The show is distributed by PRX. Scene on Radio comes to you from the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University.